Alright guys, so the work in progress balance changes are out for next month, so I'm going to read what all of them are. There's actually quite a lot of cards potentially getting a buff and a nerf in this balance change, and also we get to vote on them again. So what I'm going to do is after I read through all the balance changes, I'm going to show you the results of the poll and where it stands as of now, what cards are looking like they're likely going to get buffed and nerfed, because the results of the poll are a very big factor in the cards that they're going to end up changing. So starting off, guys, we have the Little Prince, and I have a feeling for sure this one is definitely going to be getting nerfed and voted for a lot because everyone knows how dominant it's been in the meta. Now the question is this too big of a nerf? Because as you can see, the Guardian hit points minus 11%, that's pretty substantial, and then on top of that, the damage of the Little Prince itself is going to be 9% less, so that is a pretty fat nerf. So we'll see if this is too big of a nerf or this was the right call. Next up, guys, probably not a big surprise either, are the Evolved Archers. Even though they were emergency nerf last week, it is proven that it has not been enough of a nerf, and the range of them is getting decreased by 8%, and then the power shot range along with that, minus 10%. This to me seems like a pretty fair nerf because they just recently nerfed the damage of them, so I think the range is the right call. And ever since the Goblins have been increased to 4, we have seen those a ton in the meta, so they're another potential nerf option. This is one where I'm curious if people are going to vote for them or not. Their first hit time is plus 25%. That is a very big nerf. A first hit time nerf, especially one that's 25%, is quite massive. Now this one is probably more surprising, maybe one people didn't expect to see in the balances. So they're suggesting a 8% nerf to the Rage's duration. Keep in mind this also would affect the Lumberjack too that drops a Rage. So this is one where I'm not really sure I agree with that too much. This is also one that's very interesting in my opinion, and I feel like Log you could justify it needing a nerf more, but they're also saying the Barbarrel's potentially going to get a 7% damage nerf, which I don't know if it really needs, but maybe there's just been a rise in graveyard decks and just E-Giant and Golem, and for some reason they think the Barbarrel's a problem. I don't know, but pretty interesting. And then the Evolved Royal Recruits are getting another small nerf. This is a very small nerf. I feel like the damage multiplier minus 6%. I think that this is completely justified in my opinion, and I still think there'll be a pretty decent evolution after this if it ends up going through. And this one, again, is one kind of like the Goblins where I wonder if this is too far of a nerf. The first hit time is 20% more. It's going to be increased by 20%, and the Bowler already has a pretty slow fire rate, so I wonder if this will hurt the card too much if this ends up going through, but I guess this is one that's debatable because some people do think the Bowler is pretty OP. Now we get into the buffs. This is a pretty massive buff to the Giant Skeleton, 8% health. I will say recently though, the Giant Skeleton has really sucked in the meta, so I do think it's fair for it to get a buff, but I don't know if 8% is too much. I feel like 4% or something along those lines would maybe be a little bit more reasonable. And the guards, I also agree with them getting a buff. This is an interesting one. Their shield hit points going up 7%. That's going to mean they actually will survive arrows, which is going to be a very significant interaction buff. The fact that they don't die to arrows anymore in so many matchups, it means they're just going to be getting a lot more value. And this is maybe one of the most surprising ones on here. Skeleton King buff, when in my opinion, it's already one of the best champions in the game. So I really hope in the poll people are not voting for this because I really do not think this needs a hit speed buff. The Bomber, on the other hand, 4% damage buff, this makes a whole lot more sense because the Bomber, I feel like, isn't really anything too crazy in the meta right now. You really only see it in E-Giant and Golem occasionally. The Golden Knight also definitely makes a lot more sense than the Skeleton King. Golden Knight is a lot worse than the Skeleton King ever since it got that dash range nerf, and what they're doing is they're buffing the dash damage, so they're not giving any of the dash range back. Not sure if I agree with this one, but the Archer Queen is potentially going to get a 17% duration buff, so when she uses her cloak, she's going to stay in her ability for half a second longer. I don't think this is a super massive buff, so if this goes through, it's probably not the end of the world. And then the Goblin Drill is getting kind of an interesting rework here. So it's basically getting two buffs. Its duration is going to be 11% longer, which is a whole nother second it's on the map for, assuming it's left ignored. And then the first spawn time is getting reduced 50%. That is actually a really, really massive buff because it means that first Goblin is just going to spawn so quickly. With that being said, though, it's getting a 9% hit points nerf, so maybe that's going to help balance it out a little bit. But I definitely think this rework is overall a buff to it at the end of the day. And now, guys, that I've showed you all the balance changes, let's take a look and see how the poll is going right now. By the way, you guys are still able to vote in this poll if you want to, because it's only been up for 15 hours and there's 3 days to vote, and there's 14 options for what you can vote for. Anyway, at the top of the poll, as of now, 74% of people have voted for an Evolve Archer's nerf, which is not surprising at all. That's kind of what I was saying before. Second up, we have a nerf to the Little Prince. So I was kind of expecting these two to be on here. So these are the two most voted for things. And then at 71% of people voting for the Evolve Royal Recruits to get nerfed. So this is not really surprising at all. Pretty much all the evolutions, you know, people are going to want nerfed. It's understandable because they're pretty pay to win. Now, this one may be a little more surprising. People are really wanting some of the weaker champions to get a buff. We see next up, 55% of people do want a buff to the Golden Knight. And then surprisingly, a lot of people really want that nerf to the Bowler. So that's high up there as well. Anything that's above 50%, very likely that card is going to go through in terms of the, you know, finalized balances. And then the Goblin Drill rework is also high up there. Honestly, I think this rework would be very interesting to see it go through, so I can understand why a lot of other people want to see it. And then we got the guards, which also a lot of people want to see as well. And as you guys can see, there's, you know, almost 900 people in total that voted. It's over 6,000 total votes. So if you guys want to vote, definitely be sure to do that, because your opinion definitely matters and definitely could change the tide of some of the results. And wow, I did not expect to see the Skeleton King be pretty high up. Now let's check and see what some comments are of people talking about the balances and see if there's any cards that were kind of left out of these balance changes that people felt like they missed. Another Goblin Barrel nerf. Ain't no way. Oh yeah, because if the Goblins end up getting nerfed, it affects the Goblin Barrel because their first hit time is getting increased, meaning it takes longer for them to stab, so that means the Goblin Barrel gets a massive nerf. Lucas here saying, nerf Goblin Giant, please, in all caps. So some people clearly still think the Gob Giant's too broken, even though it was emergency nerfed alongside of the Evo Archers, but I guess they decided to not include it in the balance changes. How are both of the Goblin Giant and Log escaping a nerf? So this is kind of what I was saying. I don't know why they're potentially going to nerf Bard Barrel, but they didn't consider Log, which is far more broken in my opinion. And then Riley, of course, not happy about the Goblin Barrel getting a nerf, as you would expect. That balance guy has to have some bias towards Gob Giant. How hard is it to not nerf that card, but let's nerf all the other unimportant cards around it. Also, where's the Hog and Poison nerf and Rocket buff? Where's P.E.K.K.A? Low-key, he's got a point. P.E.K.K.A does kind of suck right now, and I could easily see that deserving a buff.